God. Recording in progress.
Morning, Zoom folks. Sure.
Surveys. How close is the data we get from SPSS to the data that Google Forms gives us?
It'll be identical because it's the same data.
Okay.
Yeah.
What I figured.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. But yeah, SPSS lets you do the correlations and whatnot that you need to do, which Google Forms doesn't do, so.
Do that this week. I was like, I heard it in the library. I was like, oh, I spent so much time in the library the last month.
I think part of it has just been quieter on campus, honestly, and that makes a difference. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, because typically that's what I would hear when I opened the window, just the construction from halfway across campus. All right, good morning, everybody. We few but mighty. So today we are going to finish our last lecture of the semester. Hooray! And then you have exam 4 on Monday. So your review sheet for that is posted. It will cover 3 chapters or 3 perusals rather than 4, so it should be a little more manageable. And as usual, if you have questions, just email me over the weekend, and I will answer them. Any questions about logistics of anything going forward from either those of you in the room or those of you on Zoom? Looks like we got something in the chat here. We'll be at our normal time. I'm going to yes. So exam 4 is actually just in our last class period, and then we're using our assigned exam time to do your presentations. And I've started doing this with a lot of my classes. Number 1, because I don't give a cumulative final, so we don't really need all that time. Number 2, it means that we're not rushed trying to squish all the presentations into an hour. So yeah, really good question. Yep. Classes just at our normal time next Monday and Tuesday. Classes meet as usual. So, and it's because we started on that Wednesday in late August. Good question.
Reading day just like, hey, it's about finals, we're gonna start for the new year off.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's like, take this time to study, and then like, depending on our schedule for the semester, sometimes there's another reading day in the middle. This time it's just the weekend, basically. But yeah, it's basically like, we're giving you this day so you actually have time to study, essentially, or prepare. Woohoo! Well, back before they were understaffed, they used to be up until like 2 during finals week, I think. Alrighty. If you think of any other questions, just ask again, either during class or afterwards via email. But I am going to start by finishing our video from the other day. We only have a couple minutes left of it, but I think it's really important to learn about some of the hidden voices in psychology. So yeah, blow this up, maybe. Okay. I don't know why you're giving me a headache. Video. Hey, that's okay. We're at about minute 9.
Separate but equal was not equal. But it can be argued that no single piece of research in the history of American psychology had a greater impact on American society. Guthrie amassed a number of important contributions in his 40-year psychological career. including his part in founding the Association of Black Psychologists in 1968. But for some individuals, they are rightfully remembered for one seminal moment in their life. And for Robert Guthrie, it was a book. His book changed the landscape of scholars writing about the history of psychology. Whereas textbooks traditionally had made no mention of the contribution of black psychologists, the names of these once hidden figures began to appear, slowly at first, but then with increasing frequency. Guthrie called for a more inclusive history, and he went the extra step in providing the scholarship that made it impossible to ignore these early black psychologists. To repeat an earlier statement, even the rat was white forever altered the teaching and writing of the history of American psychology. Few psychologists and historians can make such a claim. In 2001, Robert Val Guthrie became the first African-American psychologist to deposit his personal papers in the archives of the history of American psychology at the Cummings Center for the History of Psychology at the University of Akron. They are available today for scholars to use, and they represent a goldmine of information about the first generations of black psychologists in the United States. The Cummings Center honored Dr. Guthrie and a special symposium in celebration of his work in April 2001. He died on November 6, 2005, but he is not forgotten, nor, because of him, are those black psychologists of the first half of the 20th century. Guthrie's work shines a bright light on the contributions of black psychologists, activists, and scholars, but it also reminds us of how much work is yet to be done in psychology in the service of racial equality.
Alrighty. So again, people like Guthrie are so important because typically we just talk about the mainstream people, and most of the mainstream people, unfortunately, have been white because of all the barriers that have been placed on psychologists of color. So one of the things we've talked about over and over during the semester is how vital psychology is as a subject, as a foundation for the concept of scientific literacy, the ideas and the practice of being scientifically literate. So introductory psychology provides a good foundation. It's one of the reasons why the book we use in our department is called The Science of Psychology, right? We want to really emphasize that. But lay people are still skeptical about whether psychology itself is a science. It's seen as too politically correct sometimes because we do things like talk about the intersectionality of gender and race and religion and all of that good stuff, sexuality. Some people claim that psychology is just intuition and common sense. But as we've seen throughout the semester, a lot of the discoveries psychology has made are actually counterintuitive. And then we also have these pseudoscientific views, that's supposed to say, not vies. Let me edit that real quick, just because it's going to annoy me. Views, there we go. Where essentially people sort of think, oh, well, you know, this is true and that is true, and psychology is the same as that book, The Secret, right? It's along those lines. We've been kind of laughing because my daughter has a way of just saying we're going to do what she wants to do. Let's just say, we're going to see the lights, even though we already did that. And I'm like, you keep speaking it into existence, right? Like that's the whole concept behind the Secret and you know, vision boards and things like that. And certainly they can inspire you to do the actions you need to get there, right? But certainly you need to act. So we ground our research and our practice in psychology in good theory. And we also, as we've said throughout the semester, use the scientific method, right? We come up with hypotheses, we devise a methodology for testing that, we get the results, and then we might adapt what we're doing based on those findings. And, you know, our theories can change, and in psychology, they frequently change, just like many other disciplines, honestly. So to give you an example of two essentially contemporary theories that are both debunked now, Freud had all these ideas in psychoanalysis about the Oedipus complex and, you know, you being attracted to your opposite sex parent, and that's largely debunked. And to be perfectly honest, it was largely not enjoyed by or agreed with by most of his psychoanalytic contemporaries. They were like, this is a little weird. But at the same time, sort of the opposite reaction to Freud was Skinner said, well, the brain, the mind is a black box. It doesn't matter what happens there, all that matters is observable behavior. Clearly, neither of these is 100% right? So we've adapted and changed as we get new information. And an example I was given in my neuropsych class is that we didn't realize there was neuroplasticity until the 1990s, right? Which is really not that long ago. So we used to think you were born with all the neurons and all the connections you were ever going to have, and it just, you couldn't change it. And in fact, we know that's not true. This is the last line of this chapter, and I thought it was pretty powerful. So I thought I would share it again here. So for scientific literacy, it's not just about what we know. It's about how we know it and how we conduct our lives. So that's really the crux of not only your book, but this whole class, right? And so I think that that is just really important to emphasize, that it's like how we know what we know using science, right? And then how we apply that. And thinking like a psychological scientist is really beneficial. So we can overcome our misconceptions about people and their behavior. People who think in this way are better at problem solving and decision making. Being in any type of relationship, we tend to think only of romantic relationships, right? But it also means that we are good at, you know, family relationships, friendships. It doesn't mean they're going to be perfect, but it does mean we have more skills to navigate them. And then understanding ourselves and other people around us. Thinking like a psychological scientist also helps us avoid some pitfalls, right? So if you have your psychological scientist thinking cap on, you can avoid being misled. You know, ask to see the data, ask to see the evidence. Do your own research, do a Google Scholar search instead of just looking at that post on Twitter, right? And, you know, admittedly, I don't even always do this, right? But we should get in the practice of sort of fact checking things in the world around us. That's in avoiding consistency, right? If we're always using a psychological and a scientific mindset to guide things, we'll be consistent in how we make decisions and how we act. It also helps us avoid potential hypocrisy, right? If we're preaching one thing and doing another, it's really problematic. It helps us avoid deceiving ourselves, right? Convincing ourselves that this is right when it's truly not. And it helps us avoid using data selectively, right? We try to see that big picture rather than focus on little things. So one of the things your book sort of mentions tangentially that I wanted to get more into detail for you all is what psychologists do. So what does the day-to-day job of a psychological scientist actually entail? Well, I have a little video from APA that will give us some examples.
I'm a conservation psychologist. Conservation psychology is the use of all areas of psychology to try to better understand the human relationship with the natural world.
I study cognitive neuroscience. That's the study of memory, perception, decision making.
I'm an organizational psychologist. We are scientists that study people at work.
I'm a health psychologist. We try to develop programs that can help people change and live healthier lives.
So there's just a few examples of the various ways you can be a psychologist. I think most people tend to think that psychologists are counselors, right, or clinicians. Sometimes because of their personal experiences, they might also realize they're professors, right? But they don't realize how many different ways there are to be a psychologist. So the APA has a great overview. This really doesn't even still get at all the possible subfields of psychology, but just shows you all the different overarching subfields. So yes, we have clinical and counseling, but you heard them talking about conservation or climate and environmental psychology, brain science and cognitive psychology. If you're interested in cognitive psychology in particular, Dr. Ariel is our cognitive psychologist in the department. So he's a great resource. Developmental psychology. A lot of people, when they hear developmental, they think it is only kids. And in fact, development looks across the lifespan. So essentially, really a little bit from in utero, but certainly from birth all the way to death, old age and death. So, for example, a geropsychologist who studies and works with older adults. By the way, like side note, that's like where the biggest jobs are right now because it's growing, right? They would also fall under developmental psychology. Experimental psychology are people who focus on research. And so their lives would typically be either in academia or working for, like there are now more and more essentially nonprofit research organizations. So psychologists found to kind of keep themselves out of the bureaucracy of academia. Academia has a lot of bureaucracy, y'all. Like, just like any other organization, let's be honest. If you work for the government, you're gonna have all that too, right? And that's another place where experimental psychologists might work. You know, for places like the CDC or the NIH, for example. Forensic and public service psychology. A lot of people think forensic psychologists are people like you see on CSI, right? Typically, if you're a forensic psychologist, you spend much of your time assessing people. And so you are typically sitting in an office or maybe visiting people in a prison setting to conduct assessments. And then you're writing reports based on those. I job shadowed a forensic psychologist when I was a sophomore in college. And she told me she only actually went to court to testify maybe once every 6 months. The rest of the time she wrote a report. The judge took the report at face value and didn't need her to come in and talk about it. But those people are involved in a wide range of assessments like custody evaluations, not guilty by reason of insanity, competence to stand trial. They also might be involved in doing assessments for people applying for public service jobs like the police or firefighters, for example. Health psychologists, we've talked about a couple of times. You just saw one in the video we just watched. So they work to promote health and they work in a variety of settings. Often they're now in hospital settings, but more and more they're actually being integrated into like outpatient primary care practice or other things. So while I was doing my health psych rotation, while I was on my internship, I worked on a spinal cord injury unit that did both inpatient and outpatient, on a blind rehab unit, on a medical rehab unit for people that had gotten like hips replaced or bypass surgery and needed physical rehab, and we would help them with the psychological aspects of it, in an HIV clinic, in a breast cancer clinic, in a multiple sclerosis clinic, right? And those are just like a small example of all the settings that psychologists might be involved with as a health psychologist. So part of it might be helping people to make necessary behavioral changes. So I did a lot of this on my placement year in grad school when I worked with those considering bariatric surgery to manage their weight. And then, you know, it can also be just helping people cope, right? Like, so a lot of our HIV or breast cancer diagnoses were just like, how do you wrap your head around this? And what can we do to support you? Human factors in engineering psychology is very cool. So this is kind of the cross-section of kinesiology, psychology, and technology. So these are the folks that figure out how to make technology work best for people, essentially. And so they're, I'm guessing, I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing places like Fitbit probably hire, human factor psychologists to figure out things like that. Yeah.
Eye tracking stuff like so.
Exactly. Yeah. Or they might just be an experimental psychologist, but yeah, they might be involved in that. Yeah. Or like, I think there are human factor psychologists involved in like designing new prosthetic limbs. I can't think of the word, prosthetic limbs. Yeah. So they're involved in a lot of different ways. Industrial and organizational psychology. You heard the organizational psychologist in there. Side note, if you want to make money as a psychologist, this is the field. I remember when we took our graduate level ethics and professional issues class, my second year of grad school, our professor put up a like salary chart, and like the starting salary was at least a third, if not half more than what a clinical psychologist makes. And so we all were like joking, like, okay, we're leaving, we're going to the university across the street that has that program. I mean, it's not what any of us wanted to do, so we didn't actually do it. But this is working in business settings. Often they're doing research. They may be involved in HR, but often they're much more involved in like figuring out the optimal working environment. And because they're working for corporate America, they're working within that pay structure instead of say academia or nonprofit, where you're not going to get as high of salary. Psychology of teaching and learning is typically called educational psychology. So these folks study what's the best way to learn. And so there's some development in there as well, but there's also some cognitive psychology in there as well. And these folks in practice might be the folks who are like doing assessments for kiddos, for IEPs and things like that. Quantitative psychology is another sort of up and coming field that people really like to hire people for. So these folks would develop new methods and techniques in terms of statistics or ways to analyze really complex data questions. So I think I might have mentioned this before, but by the time I got to my second semester of grad school, my husband, who has an undergraduate degree in math that focused on statistics, could no longer help me with my assignments because psychologists essentially have to develop our own methods statistically to answer the really complex questions we're getting at. So, my husband knew what an ANOVA was, but as soon as I started mentioning a MANCOVA, which is multiple with covariates, he was like, what is that, a Russian tennis player? So, and that was before I even got to like structural equation modeling and hierarchical linear modeling and all these complex methods that essentially psychologists and other social scientists have had to create in order to answer the questions they want to answer. So this is a really important subfield as well. Rehabilitation psychology help those with disabilities and chronic health conditions. So you would work in a rehab setting, for example. Social psychologist, Dr. Jackson is our social psychologist. He's not in his office right now, it's just over there. And they study essentially individual and group behavior and how this affects our perceptions and choices we make. And then sport and performance psychology is another growing field. So it uses cognitive psychology and clinical psychology, along with some stuff from human factors to help athletes optimize their performance, essentially. So again, I think that a lot of people think this is all you can do in psychology, right? It's clinical and counseling. And I should tell you the distinction between these two. So clinical psychologists typically work in like hospital settings, maybe private practice settings, academic medical centers, things like that. Counseling psychologists, not exclusively, but tend to be more in school settings, university settings, private practice, things along those lines. Although certainly those aren't mutually exclusive. when I was on my internship, we had 5 interns, and one of them was a counseling psych PhD, and he did all the same stuff we did. So. All right, so what should we be teaching you? This is another big question that departments have to sort of answer for themselves. And luckily, the American Psychological Association has provided us guidelines. And if you notice when you walk out the hall, the bulletin board between Dr. Jackson's office and my office, we actually have the poster for this up. We have 5 major goals, and there is a very lengthy document. I won't open it, but that breaks it down for us and tells us what we should be teaching you all, what we should be covering. And so these are those goals. The first one is knowledge-based. Not surprisingly, in psychology, like any other field, you need some basic overall knowledge, right? You need to be able to describe key concepts, principles, and overarching themes in psych, and develop a working knowledge of our content domains. This is why in the redesigned major, we're having you take at least 1 class from each of the content domains, right? So that we make sure you're getting the breadth that you need within our field. And we also should be thinking about how to apply psychology, right? So one of our domains that you have to take a class in is actually applied, right? So clinical or IO or something along those lines. And then goal 2, it will sound very familiar for this course, and it's scientific inquiry for the critical thinking. So using scientific reasoning to interpret psychological phenomena, we talked about that a lot this semester. Demonstrating psychological information literacy. I think y'all can do that now. Engaging in innovative and integrative thinking and problem solving. Interpreting, designing, and conducting basic psychological research. Again, this is not something we're requiring everyone to do anymore, but our BS students do have to do this now, and BA students can opt to do it. And then incorporating social cultural factors into scientific inquiry. This is such an important facet of psychology in general, but also our major redesign. We wanted that cultural competence component in there because we kind of felt like it was missing. And we want to make sure that when you're doing these things, you're thinking about how can this, someone's ethnicity or gender or race or sexual orientation impact how they might respond to this questionnaire that I'm giving them. That also plays into the ethical and social responsibility in a diverse world. So applying ethical standards to evaluate psychological science and practice. This is why our capstone is now ethics and professional issues, because we were certainly, except for maybe a lecture here and there in the applied classes, missing a comprehensive discussion of ethics. Building and enhancing interpersonal relationships. So this is why I make you do group work, even though I know people hate it, right? But this is a skill that no matter what job you end up with, you're probably going to have to exercise, right? If you go to grad school, you'll be working in a lab setting. If you go into the world of business, you'll have teams that you work with, right? So we try to help you build those skills. And then adopt values that build community at local, national, and global levels. Communication is really important as well. And so we want you to have effective writing for different purposes. That's why in this course now we're teaching you APA style. And then we have you write in pretty much all our classes, right? In some way or another. Exhibiting effective presentation skills for different purposes. So again, pretty much all my psych classes have some sort of presentation component. So you get the chance to build these skills in a lower risk environment, right? And then again, interacting effectively with others. And then goal 5 is professional development. So applying psychological content and skills to career goals. This is why we have the professional issues part of our capstone, right? We want to make sure that you have all the skills you need to understand how to do this. And then this is also why we offer an internship as an option as well. Exhibiting self-efficacy and self-regulation. This is why we give big semester-long projects and ask you to sort of work on your own timeline for them. That goes with the project management skills as well, and that teamwork capacity. Again, you'll see how important that teamwork is, right? It's been in here 3 times, but it's really critical, especially as if you think you're going to end up being a counseling or clinical psychologist, the vast majority of them are either working in tandem with or integrated into healthcare settings now. And so I've been in scenarios where I had a neurologist, a social worker, a nurse, and me all assessing someone at the same time, right? And being able to communicate effectively with those different perspectives. And then developing a meaningful professional direction for life after graduation. That could be grad school, that could be a job right away, right? Whatever works for you. We are here to support you. All right, so thinking about the skills that psychology gives you. And again, there's a nice link here that you can scope out with what are the skills you get from our major. I think a lot of times people get to the end of their major and like they create their resume and they're like, I guess I know how to use like Google Suite, right? And they don't think of the skills that this major gives you. And so I thought we could focus on those for a few minutes as well. So these are broken up into overarching categories, and the first one is cognitive. So analytical thinking and critical thinking, again, skills you're building from this class and forward, right? Understanding what statistics mean, being able to solve complex problems. Creativity, right? Thinking outside the box. You know, when we give you what might seem like a silly in-class activity, like, you know, would you approve this IRB or not, right? This is getting you to think creatively. Information management, so being adept at locating, organizing, evaluating, and distributing information from multiple sources. Wow, that sounds a lot like your poster for this class. And then judgment and decision-making, engage in logical and systematic thinking and ethical decision-making when considering the possible outcomes. We just talked about how this gives you oral and written communication skills. Again, these are things that people kind of overlook a lot of times, I think, in terms of skills they've learned. But these are skills that employers really value. And if you are choosing to go to grad school, that grad school advisors really value. So I also went to a liberal arts college, and one of the things my advisor told me later in my grad school career is she's like, I always look first at those of you who went to liberal arts colleges. He said, no, I don't have to teach you how to write. And that can be kind of onerous for people. And you might think like, well, why wouldn't everyone graduating college know how? Well, where I went to grad school, I taught undergrads as a grad student. And one of the things we do with our upper level classes is they could join a subsection, kind of like the honor sections here, where they would write a paper. And for many of them, that was the only paper they would write during college. Yeah, mind-boggling, right? You guys write for like every class. But when my classes were 90 people, right, it's a lot of time and effort for a professor to grade 90 papers. And certainly, I'm sure there are excellent professors who do that, but it's a challenge. So coming in with those skills, right? I mean, one of the things I taught ethics and professional issues for the first time last fall. And one of the things I told my students in that is, you know, make sure as you're preparing your resumes to say, like, I have experience leading a Zoom meeting, right? Because they had to lead class discussion one day, and obviously I backed them up. But I was like, that's really valuable in the modern world to say, like, I have done this. I have led the Zoom meeting. I have been the one that shares stuff. Adaptability. So psychology majors, we're pretty good at thinking on our feet, right? Figuring out what we need to do. Integrity, going again back to those ethical ideas, or even honestly back to the idea of scientific literacy, right? Thinking about as much as like maybe our personal beliefs or emotions might pull us in one direction, thinking about what does the science say, right? Self-regulation, managing time and stress by completing assigned tasks with little or no supervision, right? And certainly We give you supervision as professors, but we also give you assignments and you go off and you do them. And so again, I think a lot of people don't think of that as like a skill you learn in college, but you certainly do, right? Collaboration, we talked about a lot, right? But that's another thing that you could include under the like skills section of your resume or in a cover letter, for example. Inclusivity, again, this is why we're really emphasizing not only intersectional issues in this course, but requiring you to take at least one class that talks about those, like cross-cultural or psych of gender. Leadership, and again, this is why we have you practice presenting, working in groups, things along those lines. I don't know how much we do the management section here, but certainly coordinating with groups gives you a little vibe of that. And then service orientation, you know, again, the vast majority of our internships that people go on are with nonprofits in some way, right? So that gives you that. And I know like for some of our classes, we also get you to do service learning. For technological, just being able to learn or adapt to new software. And then familiarity with basic hardware and software. Right, so I've actually been great this semester. The vast majority of people who've been presenting in my classes are using Google Slides instead of PowerPoint, right? It's a much more open source thing that you can use, and it's so much easier to collaborate on it, right? I actually I'm presenting basically right after our class on Monday, right after my assessment class on Monday, I'm presenting at a virtual conference with two professors who are like, maybe a little more step at their race. And I was like, let's use Google Slides because then we could all work on it together. And they were like, what? And it worked out really well. So, you know, even us old dogs can learn new tricks too. Alrighty. So the next video is about 10 possible careers for psychology majors. So we will watch at least part of this.
Watching our videos is a fun way to learn some basic facts about psychology. But if you really want to dive deep into this world, then you might want to consider pursuing post-secondary education. Unfortunately, being the world's biggest Psych2Go fan doesn't quite carry the same weight on your resume. If you're dreaming of being a psychologist or a psychotherapist, then you need the education to back it up. But those aren't the only options. Psychology is actually a pretty broad discipline, and you can pursue all kinds of amazing careers with a psych degree under your belt. Substance abuse counselor. The world is in desperate need of substance abuse counselors, and it's a great career path if you really want to make a difference in someone's life. These professionals are needed more than ever, especially with the opioid epidemic and rising rates of drug abuse. Substance abuse counselors help people conquer and control their addictions through various techniques such as therapy. This can be in the form of inpatient residential rehabilitation, sober living communities, or one-on-one sessions to help the patient cope with the causes and effects of addictions. Forensic psychologist. This career path is perfect if you dream of fighting crime with your psych degree. Forensic psychologists dive deep into the minds of criminals, trying to understand their motivations and deep underlying issues. They're often in charge of deciding whether or not a criminal is a threat to the public after they've been convicted. You might not be on the front lines with the police, but you'll be fighting for justice nonetheless. Sports psychologist. You'll love this career path if you're a huge sports fan. Although athletes might seem like superhumans to us mere mortals, they suffer from the same psychological issues as the rest of us. And as any sports fan knows, athletes seriously underperform when their confidence starts to slip. These days, professional sports teams spend a fortune on sports psychologists. They train athletes to manage their stress and energy, help control their concentration and attention, and support techniques such as mental practice and visualization. Parole officer. We've all heard of parole officers before, but some of our viewers might not know that they rely heavily on psychological knowledge. With a bachelor's degree in psychology, you can jump straight into this job, making it a great option for students who don't want to spend up to 12 years in university. After spending years or decades in prison, former inmates may have great difficulty in readjusting to civilian life. That's where you come in. They help with anything from job searches to making sure that they stay out of trouble. College admissions counselor. Do you love college? Never want to leave? Well then, we've got the perfect job for you. With a bachelor's degree in psychology, it should be pretty easy to find work as a college admissions counselor. In this job, you'll help applicants enroll in their dream colleges. You'll help them with every step,
Just like side note, that sometimes this is called an enrollment counselor now. That's the language we use now. We always come up with new fancy terms.
including finances and helping students plan their academic pathways. You'll mostly work within colleges and universities, although you might also help high school students as a guidance counselor. Experimental psychologist. This is for all of you mad scientists out there. Experimental psychologists work in research labs, and they get to conduct all the amazing experiments we read about in major articles and studies. For the most part, these professionals focus on interesting theories and topics related to human behavior. At the very least, you'll need a bachelor's degree. Math and statistics skills are also a big plus. Clinical psychologist. This is what most people think when they hear psychologist. Clinical psychologists actually sit down with patients, diagnose mental disorders, and conduct psychotherapy. You can create your own private practice with this career path, which many psych students dream of. However, to reach this level, you'll need a doctoral degree. Although these psychologists work directly with patients, they might also publish their findings in journals. This is definitely the most common career path for psychology majors out there. Marriage therapist. This is a great option if you're aiming for a master's degree. After you get your bachelor's degree, you can get a master's specifically in marriage counseling. After that, you can start helping couples
The degree is often called MFT, Marriage and Family Therapist. So if anyone's interested in this.
strengthen their relationships and help identify struggles they may be having at home. Marriage therapists provide a neutral space for partners to discuss what may be negatively impacting their marriage. Your job is to facilitate an open discussion and provide suggestions to strengthening their relationship. Military psychologist. War takes an enormous toll on the human mind, and we're only just beginning to understand the extent of this. As a military psychologist, you'll be helping members of the armed forces with various issues, such as PTSD. Some military psychologists even deploy with the armed forces and operate in bases on enemy soil. This is an incredibly demanding job, but if you're keen on supporting your country by supporting armed forces, it is definitely a career worth considering.
One thing I'll say about military psychologists is they often also do research. So I have a friend who works for the Navy, and I think 75% of her job is doing research, essentially. So trying to figure out the best ways to do a suicide prevention program, because unfortunately we know death by suicide is one of the biggest issues in young Army and other veterans right now. The other thing, if you're thinking you would like a career in the military psychology, there are ways that you can essentially get your doctorate through one of the military academies or something sponsored by them, and they would pay for it, but then you would essentially owe them X years of service afterwards. You would still get paid, but you would have to say, yes, I'll work for you for 3 or 10 years or whatever afterwards. So, but it wouldn't be a hardship because military psychologists, like IO psychologists, get paid really well.
Speech language pathologist. Let's end things with something a little obscure. A speech language pathologist helps people with their speech patterns. This goes much deeper than just eliminating stutters or lisps. They also help with language delay, reading comprehension, writing, and basically every disorder related to speech or communication. To become a speech language pathologist, you need to have a master's degree. What do you think of the career paths we've mentioned? Do any of these appeal to you? Tell us about your dream career paths and why you love.
Many of these guilty you. You try hard, Google captions. Yeah, Amani, I saw that you wanted to be a military psychologist. That's awesome. You know, again, a great option. If you're interested in, you know, maybe working with folks on those issues, but not being, you know, like active duty yourself, an idea for civil service work in that area would be to work for the VA. Again, those careers pay pretty well. This is, I don't remember how this came up, but we had this conversation when I was at dinner with some friends on Saturday night. So when you're on something, even like our naval base, our naval shipyard, right, our army bases around here, you are on federal property. So technically, if you go to Oceana, you're not in Virginia anymore, right? You're on federal property. Because of that, if you go to work for the VA, you're also on federal property. So the VA doesn't care where you're licensed as a psychologist, they only care that you are licensed. So I knew a couple people, I don't remember which state it was, if it was like Mississippi or Alabama or Louisiana, one of those three has like the easiest licensure in the country. So I know a couple people who like went there for their postdoc so they could get licensed there and then work for the VA, and they're, you know, good to go. They don't need to get relicensed every state you move to. If you're a clinical psychologist or even, you know, a master's level therapist, oftentimes if you move states, you have to take a separate licensure exam for that state because every state's laws are different. And essentially they want to ensure that you know their laws. But if you work for the VA, even if let's say you're working at the Hampton VA and then, you know, maybe your partner gets transferred or you just decide, I'd rather live in California, and you move over to like the San Diego VA, then your license just carries, right? And so that's a big advantage of that. There are systems in place within psychology that are trying to remedy some of that. So for example, and this is like a little highbrow, but I feel like y'all can handle it. But after you get your doctorate, just like after you get your medical degree, you can opt to go on to be what they call board certified, which is another set of exams that you would go through. And in psychology, it's called the ABEP, and I'm going to forget what it is. I think it's American Board of Professional Psychology. And there's a whole bunch of different options of where you can get ABEPT. We use it as a verb because, you know, we like to make up words. So just sort of pull this up and you can see somewhere, they should have a list. Maybe here. I hope that's the people who are ABEPT. Application information. Okay, I'm not gonna be able to find the list for some reason. Maybe that's it. Okay. Yep, there we go. Anyway, there are a whole bunch of different, maybe it's under academies. There we go. Yeah, so you can get essentially ABEPT in any of these specialty areas. So like clinical neuropsychology or group psychology, so someone who would focus on that. And so you go through an extensive exam process, and then if you are awarded this board certification, you get to put that after your name. And then as it says here, many places now, I think this is the vast majority of the states, not all of them. Okay, it just says whether or not there's recognition. There's some that don't have recognition, but a lot of the states now, if you have this board certification, you don't have to go through relicensure. You just tell them like, I'm board certified, and that means you've gone above and beyond already. And so they just sort of transfer your license, essentially. It's additional time, additional money. I don't think that like patients care or know what it means, right? But within the professional world, it certainly means a lot. My only experience related to ABEP is one of my grad professors reached out to students and alums at one conference that we all go to and said, hey, would anyone be willing to help with an ABEP exam? So I went in, the guy was getting certified in clinical psychology, and I pretended to be his supervisee. And I talked about a difficult client that I had. And So then there was a whole panel of people watching him supervise me, basically. So it was like a role play or a simulation. That was really cool. It's just an experience for me. It was actually a client I wasn't seeing anymore because I think it was my first year here, so I wasn't seeing clients. But afterwards, I was, man, I wish I was still seeing her. All the advice he gave was great. But I got to see just a little snippet of like how involved that process is. Alrighty, any questions about, I mean, I know you have tons of questions about psychology in general, but the other thing I'll put a little plug in for is if this has inspired you to start thinking about careers more, Jessica Harrington in The Lighthouse is our career development and internship person. And not only is she just fabulous in general, but her master's is in counseling psych. So she's like extra great for our majors in terms of helping you sort everything out. And she's always glad to meet with you either in person or remotely, and really helpful from everyone I've talked to who's met with her. So. All right, well, thanks for an awesome semester of lectures. I will see you on Monday for the exam, and then for our presentations later on. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Professor Myers.
Yeah, hi, Oliver.
Hi. I about to text you, but I didn't want you to end the Zoom before I texted you.
No problem. In my office, I do. Yeah, give me just a second to chat with Oliver, and then I can go over and grab him. That was easier than I thought.